So we are back and taking a look at episodes 7 and 8 of Netflix's Chilling Adventures of Sabrina, and thankfully what I was hoping for came to pass. These are really great 2 episodes. Again, not to kind of poo-poo episodes, yeah, I said poo-poo, episodes 5 and 6, but again, and I think maybe it was a necessary bit of a slowdown, but episodes 7 and 8, Feast to Feast and The Burial, really get things moving forward. So let me jump in. I'm going to give you some of the highlights, some of the things I liked. I love the way the witches celebrate Thanksgiving. You know, not quite in as friendly and nice and less gruesome manner as we do. This idea of the Feast to Feast that celebrates the 14th witch who sacrificed herself so that the 13 original witches could survive as long as possible involves what you would consider to be a really huge, great celebration, except for one thing. The person, I guess you could say the pageant winner who gets the tribute, I guess, who gets voted to be queen of the feast, is literally going to be the feast. They gives herself over and gets eaten by the rest of the guests. Yeah, it's as gruesome as you would expect, but I really love the setup behind that. We knew Sabrina was going to try to and step in for Zelda, but I thought it was very interesting that Prudence got selected as the queen of the feast moving forward. And I loved that with Sabrina as her handmaiden and essentially in servitude to Prudence for the next couple days, that Sabrina also got a chance to show Prudence what the Baxter High life was like. Now, what long-term impact this may have, I'm not quite sure, because there are a couple things Sabrina does in these 2 episodes we're going to touch about in a minute. But I love that interaction and that interplay that existed. I was a really big fan of that. The other thing I want to talk about is the weird witch that we are introduced to. Keep her in mind. I thought that was an instance where it was just like, oh, well, we know. You can get a pretty good idea where this is going to be factoring. So a little bit in that regard. The hunting of the deer. Let me just say that was gross beyond all measure, but I thought was very effective. And this idea of establishing that the Kinkles could be witch hunters, I thought was a nice turn of phrase. Now, whether this turns out to be true or not, I thought it would be an interesting take if it was, especially when you consider everything Sabrina's been doing and applying magic to Harvey constantly, which I think is going to be a big problem down the road. I thought that was a nice, interesting turn, as was this idea of Lady Blackwood essentially fixing and rigging the contest so that Prudence would be queen of the feast, because she doesn't like the fact that Father Blackwood apparently liked to spread his wand around a little bit, and that Prudence is actually, as we find out later on with the truth cake, Prudence is actually Father Blackwood's daughter. And, well, let's just say Lady Blackwood doesn't want anybody who's going to potentially step in line to any potential heir or heirs that she's going to have. So again, that dynamic I thought was excellent. And Hilda, I'm just loving all the time. The whole truth cake, just the way she kind of has a little bit of a swagger about herself now, even though you know she's hurting from the idea that she was excommunicated. Sabrina, the attempt to end the festival I thought was a nice touch, but again, what a surprise. Weird Witch comes into play, sacrificing herself, making herself the queen, once again proving herself in all of this, and keeping the tradition alive. And there's so much that can be taken out of that. This idea of the self-hatred and wanting to keep perpetuating old, bad, in this case, painfully misogynistic things. I think there are volumes that could be written on that. The scene where she gets just eaten is just disgusting. I think there's no other way for me to put that. I think it's effective. I think it's a good way of dragging us back to the reality of, as great as everybody looks and as wonderfully as this shot and everybody says wonderful things, there is a rough, gross, animalistic aspect to their faith, and let's not forget that. And this episode, I think, really reminded us of that. It was a nice contrast to the orgy scene earlier, in case you think I was going to skip over that. How could you? I was so shocked by it, I had to go back and look at it again. But I just thought there was a nice contrast, and this is what their faith is about. You know, it's the animalistic pleasures, the animalistic urges, and they just came into play in this episode. I loved Aunt Zelda and that really nice way she ended it by saying, like, look, it wouldn't matter if the Dark Lord wanted it or not, Sabrina, this wasn't going to happen to you. Now, that segues into the burial, and in case you forgot, the Weird Sisters think that the Kinkle family, they're witch hunters, and they're not particularly fond of the things that they did deer hunting, taking out a familiar, all of that, and especially Harvey. But so what they do is they essentially try to bring the mind down upon Harvey and Tommy. Now, thankfully, Sabrina's hit Harvey up with a protection spell. Tommy is not so lucky. So yeah, that's where we kind of where things start to get a little complicated. There's a very sweet scene between Harvey and Sabrina where they're sleeping in the back of the pickup truck, and I say that because they represent this scene so beautifully in a sense of two people who just wish they could make the entire world go away. And there was it was in that moment that I was remembered, and we all should remember, at the end of the day, we're talking about teenagers. And I think Lynch and Shipka do an excellent job of, even with all this fantastical stuff going on, still keeping a ground on the idea. At the end of the day, these kids just want to have a normal life, and they want a normal family, and they want all their friends to get along and everything like that. And I thought that was a particularly strong touch. Aunt Z, and I want to make sure I get her, Miranda Otto, I know I've been referencing her time again. Her transition to motherly figure, I thought, has been fantastic. But I think in this episode, we also see her transition to this idea of being a more full and well-rounded woman. And I think somebody who can be a very good, strong, well-rounded role model for Sabrina. And I think that says a lot. Don't know if I was feeling that in the first episode. So that's a very good progression going into, as we look at the 8th episode. I'm glad we finally got an explanation of the Cain and Abel aspect of Zelda and Hilda, and the fact that Cain and Abel's soil and dirt, I thought was just a really fantastic touch. The funeral, again, very painfully uncomfortable. Again, bringing reality back into the sense of the supernatural. And we see, again, Aunt Z stepping in and doing the right thing, feeling for that situation and that family aspect. The Sabrina and Wardwell, that just, again, I gotta say, I think it demonstrates quickly how much Sabrina's moving away from her mortal life. How easy it was for her to just believe somebody who wants to believe in her and essentially raise the dead. And I think we've all seen enough horror movies to know that doesn't work out well. But I think it just represents in their dynamic that, look, Sabrina may not be resisting this change as much as possible, that she is getting much more seduced and lured into this idea of her witchcraft and her supernatural aspect. Plus, she's doing things that she's going to have to pay the bill for. You cannot be dabbling in magics even up to this point. And now you want to pull a double switch of just resurrecting the dead and resurrecting another dead. Again, I think Ambrose does a great job in saying you can't keep writing these checks with your magic that your butt can't cash. And I think that's the best way to describe it. I love the scenes with Zelda and Blackwood and the fact that they still have a little something going on in that regards. Very interesting dynamic about Blackwood and Ambrose, and offering him immunity if Ambrose will talk about his cohorts that helped him take out the Vatican, and Ambrose really standing his ground. And while I don't know what to think about Blackwood, and I'm going to question his every move, the idea of allowing him to attend the academy and work, I think, is a nice gesture. I'm also not naive enough to think that it also is going to give him an in with Sabrina and also give him a connection with the house. So that's always going to come into play too. That double switcheroo that Sabrina was attempting, I thought was pretty bold. Again, I asked the question, and I think the ending pretty much raises it, and I meant that pun, actually. At the end of the day, in all of these universes, does Stephen King's Pet Sematary exist? Don't we know exactly what bad happens when we raise the dead? It's never good, and it's usually something more than a cat.